All right, well, welcome, everyone. My name is Rick Waters. I'm director of the uh, Carnegie China Center in Singapore and the Hank Greenberg Chair. And I'm really pleased to be here today to talk about an important topic, China-India relations. It's been a fascinating decade plus between Modi and President Xi. And here today with us, we have Saheb Singh Chadha from the Carnegie India Center, our senior resident analyst there. We have Lili, who is Deputy Director of the Institute for International Relations at Tsinghua, and also the Deputy Secretary General of the World Peace Forum and a published author on the topic. And Jabin Thomas Jacob, who is an Associate Professor and widely published author on the topic as well. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to my colleague Saheb and look forward to a really interesting discussion. Thanks to you all.
So this discussion, we are really convening this at quite a timely and pertinent moment. It's the 75th anniversary of India-China relations. Both of these countries have a rich, storied history, one that has faced its fair share of tensions because of the border dispute, because of larger India-China competition. But why it's particularly relevant today, and I want to bring this to the present, is that you've had 5 years of a standoff between India and China on their shared border in eastern Ladakh/Tibet. And what that has done is really, it's served in some sense, I would say, as an inflection point for the relationship. On the Indian side, you've had sort of the strategic community achieving what I can only call sort of clarity with regards to the challenge it faces from China. And perhaps there are some lessons on the Chinese side as well, which I will turn to Professor Lili to tell us more about. But I just want to comment on the present state of the relationship before I turn to my co-panelists for their opening remarks, which is, as I said, you've had a standoff for the past 5 years, and that has significantly affected the relationship. For India, the border is the front and center of the India-China relationship, and its publicly stated stance is that the border cannot be separated from the rest of the relationship. Peace on the border is necessary for the furthering of broader India-China exchanges in the economic domain, in the multilateral domain, in several other domains as well. And so that has sort of held back the relationship from progressing over the past 5 years. But now we are at a point where over the past year, you've had disengagement in the sort of remaining two friction points in eastern Ladakh, in Depsang and Demchok. And that has really, as the External Affairs Minister said to the Indian Parliament in December, it has brought to an end the task of disengagement. Now both sides are left with de-escalation and, if possible, and if desirable, de-induction of troops. But that task of disengagement finishing has opened the way for a re-engagement between India and China. So as a result, they are today at a stage of nascent normalization. And so what are the sort of exchanges that we are seeing? You had the Indian Special Representative on the India-China boundary question, National Security Advisor Ajit Doval, visiting Beijing at the end of December after a gap of several years. You had the Indian Foreign Secretary visiting in January after a gap of several years. And from the statements coming out, it seems that both sides are now trying to sort of have a limited re-engagement where they are trying to first and foremost pick the low-hanging fruit in the relationship in terms of river water data sharing or in terms of resuming the Kailash Mansarovar Yatra and resuming sort of broader economic engagement. And there is particularly an attempt on both sides to have a public face where the temperature of the relationship is, you had sort of over the past 5 years a very heightened rhetoric, heightened temperature because of the border clashes. Now there's an attempt to bring that under control and portray a more positive outlook. I feel that is with a view to strengthen a hand in negotiations and allow the atmosphere to adopt more conciliatory positions. But it can still be said that there is absolutely within the system, within all levels of the Indian government, there is still a deep mistrust about the relationship with China. And rebuilding this distrust, rebuilding trust will take years and perhaps longer. So what we find is this limited re-engagement has begun, and now both sides are trying to find their feet after 5 years of dialogue only on the standoff and not on much else. So I'll stop with that, and I'll turn over to my colleague, to my co-panelist rather, Professor Lili from Tsinghua University, to deliver her opening remarks.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. It's a great honor to share my personal views on the evolving China-India relations. There have been numerous explanations of the latest ups and downs of China-India relations. Unfortunately, the border issue has been a long-standing irritant in China-India relations. The fundamental research puzzle for me in recent years is that why sometimes the two sides can well manage the problem while sometimes they cannot. My finding is that the border dispute is more a barometer than a major determinant of the evolution of China-India relations. Therefore, my argument is that we should view China-India relations in a broader context. In my opinion, the evolving power configuration, both at the global and regional levels, has played a significant role in shaping the mutual perceptions of China and India and their policies toward each other, including their approaches to the border issue. As the Indian Strategic Circle points out, in the first 2 decades after the end of the Cold War, India shared interests with China in promoting a multipolar world. The RIC, Russia, India, China trilateral, and later the BRICS were part of the efforts to balance the US unipolarity. In 2010, when China became the second largest global economy, the world seemed to be shifting from unipolarity to bipolarity. India started to treat the rise of China as the main challenge. India recalibrated its foreign policy by calling for a multipolar Asia, and later on got on board of the US Indo-Pacific strategy through deepening bilateral strategic ties and joining the US-led minilaterals such as the Quad and IPAF. From the Chinese perspective, a stable and amicable relationship with India is always significant due to China's complex neighborhood. Since the end of the Cold War, China's strategic focus has been in its east. There have been asymmetric threat perceptions between China and India, with India having more apprehensions toward China, while China having higher expectations for cooperation with India. However, since the US adapted its national security strategy and started its great power competition against China, the growing Indo-US strategic ties have increased China's concerns about India. As far as the US Indo-Pacific strategy is concerned, China is the target, while India is the partner. It is impossible for China not concerning India's role in the US Indo-Pacific strategy. In my opinion, the asymmetric threat perception might become symmetric in a great power competition area if China and India are on the opposite sides. The 4.5-year standoff just happened under these circumstances. With the return of Trump to the White House, the world order is experiencing another dramatic change. This time, the US commitment to international norms, institutions, as well as its allies and partners are under great challenges. A multipolar world and a multipolar Asia seems to be gaining momentum, but with a lot of uncertainties and unpredictabilities. Many countries have recalibrated their foreign strategies to ride the new tides. In my opinion, the last October thaw between China and India was also a preemptive response to the Trump 2.0. Of course, mistrust between China and India are still deep, and it takes time to overcome. Therefore, I do not expect a very quick and full-fledged recovery of bilateral cooperation. However, as to major emerging economies and most populous countries, China and India shared interests in maintaining peace and growth in Asia and the world. On the one hand, it is imperative for them to find a lasting roadmap to well manage the border difference. On the other hand, there's a window of opportunity for them to increase strategic communications on regional economic integration, Asia Pacific or Asian security architecture, as well as international norms and institutions for global peace and prosperity. I just stop here.
Thank you, Professor Lee. Jabin, do you want to join in with your opening remarks, please?
Yeah, thank you, Saheb. So, I want to go back to some of the points that both you and Lily raised. And I'm going to start with you, Saheb, when you said that, disengagement is done. And I sort of want to challenge that notion. I think on paper, yes, disengagement appears to be done. But I think there is still a distance to be covered in terms of verification of the disengagement process. There are particular aspects of disengagement, for example, the no patrolling zones, and a couple of these points of friction that need to be resolved. Because from the Indian point of view, we should not get into a situation where it's two steps forward, for the Chinese, and you negotiate and the Chinese take one step back, but we are still at a disadvantage. Now, this is not to say that normalization in India-China relations is not necessary. It is absolutely necessary. The world does not stand still, and economic conditions both in China and in India mean that the two countries need to find a way to engage with each other. And also there is, the global international environment. The world is in flux. Both Chinese and Indian leaders have frequently referred to a world of uncertainties, the world in amidst change. So, they cannot pursue their individual destinies if they are going to be in a constant state of conflict, whether explicit or implicit. We are neighbors, we have a long history together, and geography being what it is, it's simply not possible for either of us to grow if we are going to be in tension or conflict with each other. Now, even as normalization is now sort of the order of the day, Lily described it as the constant ups and downs of the relationship. It does not mean that, of course, tensions on the border cannot continue. But I think credit must be given to India and China to, for finding a way, despite their tensions, to have reached this point. I think, Indian Prime Minister, Indian leaders have constantly talked about not, letting, disputes turn into conflict. And I think this is an example in how the two countries have managed to sort of find some way out of these tensions. The problem really is we have not achieved status quo ante 2020, right? As you pointed out, Saheb, disengagement is only the first step. We still have the de-escalation of troops, the de-induction of troops that remains to be done. And unfortunately, it would seem to me, at least from the Indian side, this issue seems to have been pushed off the radar. And I think that is not, that is not a healthy trend for the longer term, because, however much economic interests are important for two countries such as China and India, which are still, I think, despite 75 odd years of existence, they are still in a stage of national development, still in a stage of solidifying sovereignty, territorial control, territorial integrity are still these are all important issues still for both countries. So the security dimension will constantly, be as important, if not more important, than the economic engagement. So which is why it is necessary to, resolve these tensions. I mean, of course, we've had a boundary dispute for a very long time. But the understanding until 2020 was, while the boundary dispute exists, we could still manage or carry on conversations in other areas. But 2020, I think, was sort of a 1962 moment for a whole new generation of Indians. It sensitized a whole lot of Indians, or several generations of Indians, to the China factor, now considered a China problem in India's foreign policy, in India's security relationship. And, now that the sort of genie is out of the bag, as it were, we'll have to pay attention to this issue alongside everything else. And both will affect each other. The security issues will affect the economic relationship, and the economic relationship will impact the security relationship. Now, I agree with Lily on the imperative for the two countries to find a way to engage with each other. But there is also, besides the boundary dispute, there's also a fundamental mismatch in the worldviews that each country has. And this really relates a great deal to the domestic political imperatives in each country. And as I said before, these are countries still at a stage of state formation. They are not fully confident, each of them, in terms of their national strengths, in terms of their organization of the countries, of their respective countries. So these issues fundamentally affect their foreign policy, international worldviews, and drive their security and economic agenda. From the Indian point of view, there is a certain lack, our perception is there's a certain lack of Chinese sensitivity to Indian interests in the region, globally, and there's an expectations mismatch. We think that the Chinese ascribe altogether too much agency to the United States in this relationship. China's sort of practically existential conflict with the Americans has sort of led to a very black and white ordering of the world, in which, well, if India doesn't agree fully with the Chinese on one or the other issue, it means that, India is aligned with the United States, which is not true at all. India has an independent view of the United States, and India disagrees with the United States on multiple issues. And so this is something that, doesn't quite really, attract enough attention or sensitivity on the Chinese side. So there's a tendency to slot India in as part of, the American camp. And this is despite a lot of Chinese rhetoric on India and China being ancient civilizations, India and China both. So I think unless this sort of approach changes, we are likely to face continued problems. But I think for the moment, this normalization imperative will continue. The Trump administration's moves, the general international environment, I think, sort of are creating conditions in which India and China can come together. And they need to come together on a bunch of global governance issues. They need to work together if some progress is to be made, both for their individual interests as well as what they constantly talk about as collective interests of the global South. So I'll stop there.
I just want to briefly respond to is that, yes, the road to trust, at least for India, in the India-China relationship, flows through the border, flows through security and peace and tranquility at the border. And, Professor Lili, you talked about the US factor, and I will ask you more about that. But I would just say that India's relationship with the United States is motivated by pursuit of its own development needs and, of course, its security needs. But so, Professor Lee, if I could sort of ask you, you spoke about how, the moves in October last year, the meeting, that was a preemptive maneuver to sort of forestall any friction and stabilize one front before the US-China front perhaps heated up, or just by the fact of its unpredictability, China wanted to stabilize one front. But I wanted to ask you, there's been talk in certain quarters that the headwinds that the Chinese economy is facing perhaps also may have been an imperative for China to pursue this sort of outreach to India. So I wanted your thoughts on that. If you could please tell me about that. Professor Lee, you're on mute.
Okay, yeah. Thank you for your comment and the question. My understanding, first, China has always, expect a good relations and cooperation with India. Even after this, standoff, China has always, talked to our India counterpart that we should not let this border issue to block our cooperation in other areas. This is number one. Number two, I think, as I mentioned, from the Chinese perspective, when the US introduced this Indo-Pacific strategy, in the past, we just talk about Asia-Pacific. Why it is Indo-Pacific? From the US side, it's just want India to join the US strategy in this area to check China. So because of this logic, China is very much concerned about India's role or India's response to the US Indo-Pacific strategy. So, definitely we appreciate India's strategic autonomy very much. And we also know that India has also many, differences from the US. But how about India's response to the US request, to have India on board of their Indo-Pacific strategy, which is very much directed, against China. So that's the logic. So my understanding that's definitely from the Chinese side, when the US shift its, grand strategy and focus on the great power competition, India's role, or our perspective about India has changed quite a lot. Definitely, it still depends on how India will, respond to the US. Yeah.
If I could just follow up, you said that China's perspective of India has changed a lot. Could I ask you to sort of elaborate more on that? And if I could briefly respond, there is a fair bit of overlap between India and the United States in terms of the Indo-Pacific, but India also advocates for a free, open, and inclusive Indo-Pacific, which is the reference to China and the recognition that China is a stakeholder, is a power in the region. But if I could ask you to elaborate more on what you said, that China's perception of India has changed a little bit.
Okay. I can put it in this way. When Prime Minister Modi made a keynote address in Shangri-La Dialogue in 2018, I think in that dialogue, he talked about the inclusive Indo-Pacific. I think that address actually was very much welcome in China. But when we look at when India joined that the mini-lateral such as Quad, there will be a lot of concerns, and also for example, whether India will join or coordinate with US in the South China Sea, something like that. I just see, my point is that, I just want to say that, as Professor Jabin said, it seems that China should not care too much about India's relations with the US I do not quite understand, agree. Yeah.
All right, that's fair enough. Jabin, you mentioned something in your opening remarks about the domestic political imperatives in China and how that affects its foreign policy. Can you sort of place that in the Indian context and say how does the CCP's sort of domestic priorities affect India-China relations specifically? You're on mute, Jabin.
So yeah, in India we are I think I mean not just in India but I think all around the world I think we are increasingly beginning to understand that China is called a party state for a reason, and there is a particular worldview that emerges from the fact that China is a party state and this is a regime that seeks to preserve itself in power. And foreign policy, domestic interests, economic interests, all of these derive from this particular objective. So I think, from our point of view, of course, we've understood this in India for a very long time. I think what is different today is that other countries are beginning to follow this and understand this as well. So how does this affect India? I mean, the relationship with India, I think, in part, I think there's a much, and I mentioned this before, that, China sees itself as an existential competition with the United States. I think, in normal state-to-state relations, you don't need to see these things as existential issues. You would see that there's a bit of give and take, there's transactions, but you don't necessarily look at any relationship as a zero-sum game. This is a globalized world. We are well past, I mean, in the 21st century, the idea was that greater trade, greater economic engagement would lead to benefits all around. But if you have an existential sort of approach to these things, you begin to see the world in a zero-sum game, then we are in trouble, right? And that is when it becomes easier to order the world in black and white. You're either with us or against us. And I think that is really the fundamental problem. Frankly, China is not now unique in all of this. I think a lot of countries, including what we see in the United States today, is really now a zero-sum approach, right? And that, we could have a larger discussion on the economic systems or models that lead to this kind of thinking and popularity of this kind of approaches. But China has been at it much, much longer. I think that's a consideration. And so to sort of maybe address one other issue, frankly, I think, on the India-US dynamic, it's also the case that India and the United States have very different understandings of what the Indo-Pacific is. The Quad, from the Indian point of view, is not at all a military objective. I think we repeatedly argue we do not have a military objective with the Quad. Whether you believe it or not is a different thing. At least from the government's point of view, this is the reality, right? But in fact, the government actively does not engage from a military point of view. There are other military exercises, etc., that can work. India and the US, might engage on a lot of issues, but like I said, we also have disagreements, and we have vehement disagreements. I mean, if India-US relations were so strong, we wouldn't have the kind of tariffs ongoing as we see at this moment. So I guess the Chinese need to take it up with the Americans. Look, what is your deal with the Indians? But you should look at what the Indians are saying and doing to see where the Quad is going or what the Indo-Pacific is all about.
Since we are on the topic of sort of broader regional geopolitics, I want to turn to another player in the region, which is Russia. And Jabin, I'll ask you this, and Professor Lee, please feel free to come in, which is, what is the state of play in the China-Russia-India triangle, given that the United States is adopting a far more hard-nosed approach to even its allies and partners in Asia and talking with the Russians? Will we see a resumption to some extent of the RIC format, which, as I understand it, has been on the down low since 2021?
So I think this is a good example of where India charts its own path. In fact, the RIC, at least at the academic level, has seen something of a revival. I was part of an academic trilateral in Moscow in October. So clearly, on the Indian side, this is entirely track 2. endeavor, but from the Chinese and the Russian side is almost 1.5. So there is a great deal of, but still these things that work with government encouragement. So I think this shows you that India will chart its own paths depending on its own circumstances and interests. The fact that we are engaged with the Russians and the Chinese show that, while we have our considerations and our interests with respect to the United States, we also have independent considerations and interests with respect to the Russians and the Chinese, and that we will continue to do so. We don't want to be pushed around. We don't like being pushed around. And we are big enough to actually, convey this point in no uncertain terms. And I think those who wish to partner with us, those who wish to engage with us, must take this point into consideration.
Okay, may I? Yeah, I can't hear you. Yeah. Okay. I think when we look at the evolution of this RIC cooperation, my understanding is that the evolution of RIC actually again reflects my argument that this major power relations evolve along with the evolution of this unipolarity, bipolarity, or multipolarity. My argument is that, when you examine it carefully, you can find sometimes, Russia or India are were the strong support of this RIC cooperation. Sometimes it was China and Russia. And, when India have a better or closer relations with the US, you can find the internal domestic debate in India about whether India should keep away from this RIC or keep away from the SCO, even the BRICS. So the debates have been there in India, So my understanding is that from the Chinese perspective, we definitely expect India to be, observe its strategic autonomy, not taking sides. I just say it's not we wish to have India with us, but at least I think India with strategic autonomy is in the interest of China. Yeah, thank you.
Just to respond to the points under discussion, in November, when India's External Affairs Minister, Dr. Jaishankar, met Foreign Minister Wang Yi, the statement that he made, it's on the record, actually outlines that India follows an independent foreign policy dictated by its own strategic interests. Just a note on that. But we are on the topic of Russia, China, and I think I can bring in Central Asia here. Professor Lee, China holds the presidency of the SCO this year. And my personal view is that part of the motivation for the outreach from China in October was also to clear the way for India's sort of active participation in the SCO, because China, I think, to some extent would care about India as a member of the Global South participating in this regional grouping. How accurate is that sense? And the bottom line being, how much does China care about India's active participation at the SCO? Professor Lee, you're on mute.
Okay. Yeah, I hope I got your question clearly or correctly. My understanding is that, I don't think to have India, attend this SCO summit in China this year is a major driver for this SAW. As I already, argued, what is behind this, change, I think they are the driving forces on both sides to have a better relations or to normalize, stabilize their relations. So this is number one. Number two, for the SCO summit, of course, it is very important. But to be frank, after India and Pakistan, joined the SCO, this relations in this mechanism becomes more a little bit complex than before. So my understanding, definitely this recent thaw between China and India will help the success of this year's SCO summit. And I noticed that the Indian government have frequent, time and again emphasized their support to this summit. Yeah.
I wanted to turn to one sort of question, which is the Tibet factor, which I feel will sort of increasingly assume significance there are questions, and the Dalai Lama also recently made a statement about his preference for a successor. How much is the Tibet factor at present a factor in India-China relations, and do you foresee this sort of becoming increasingly important, and in which way? And I'll pose this question to both of my panelists, but Professor Jabin, if you'd like to go first.
So on the Tibet factor, I think this is not the principal factor that drives, India-China relations today. It is an important factor, at least from the Chinese point of view. This is the central issue that is at the heart of the boundary dispute, the question of Chinese control over Tibet, because, this is historically the India-Tibet border, isn't it? So I think this is certainly a big issue from the Chinese point of view, but from our point of view, we don't see, at least I personally don't see that this as a salient. Enjoying the salience that did in the past. We have now new issues that are complicating the bilateral relationship. My colleague Lily just talked about Chinese concerns about Indian strategic autonomy. No matter what we say, like I said, the worldview in China does not allow an acceptance of Indian strategic autonomy. Even if we say that we are acting in strategic, we have strategic autonomy, even if our actions show it, the worldview in China is about making it black and white. And if India were to act strategically or rather autonomously from a strategic sense, that would mean this is a three-corner triangle. It's not a two-sided contest. And in a three-corner triangle, the choices before China are much more complicated. So in a Manichaean black and white system, it's easier for China or the Chinese worldview to slot India as a junior partner to the United States rather than ascribing agency to India. So I think I think that needs to be taken into account as well. So this really is from the Indian point of view, this is a source of additional tension in the India-China relationship. Plus, we have global factors complicating it. We have economic issues intervening. We have regional issues intervening. We have global things like issues like climate change. How are we going to develop common governance or common rules to govern artificial intelligence, for example? How are we going to go about bringing to common standards in digital administration, for example? If India and China cannot work on these things and continue to remain mired in the past, I think it's not prospects for global peace, global stability, regional stability are not going to look good.
We have a few questions coming in.
Yeah.
Before that, Professor Lee.
Yeah. On the Tibet issue, I think it should not be a factor between China and India, because in the past we have several joint statements already solved this problem. From the Indian side, it has its own commitment to China on this issue. So I don't think it should be a factor at all. Second, I think on the world views, I don't think China and India have more difference. Actually, we have a lot of common stance. Before this standoff, before these tensions, actually what attract more cooperation between China and India is on the multilateral levels. We have good cooperation on climate change because of we have common grounds. We don't need to attract or push the other side. We just come together. So I totally agree. On many global issues, we have even on the regional issues, we have many common grounds, and especially at this moment, when the globe, the world is become very different. A lot of rules or norms or institutions are meeting, great challenges. It is the time for China and India to come together, because both China and India, we are the most populous countries in the world. We have a lot of, domestic issues to be resolved. We need a friendly, environment, international environment for our development. So I think we should focus more on the common grounds between us. Yeah.
Saheb, you're on mute.
Am I audible? Yeah. So the question is, when you think of the India-China sort of military balance and the military competition that's taking place, which one in the long run has actually more strategic implications? Is it actually the boundary dispute and the land military balance, or is it competition in the maritime domain? Professor Jabin, if you'd like to take this.
Yeah, I think as of now, it is the boundary dispute that is at the heart of tensions in the relationship. But I suspect that we will see the third Chinese aircraft carrier in the Indian Ocean before long. So I think in a strategic sense, naval competition is the sort of problem to look out for.
I don't think I do not really think there's a military competition between China and India. When I understand when from the Indian perspective, they are very much worried about China's power, maybe 5 times big, military defense expenditure is maybe 3 times or 3 times bigger than India. But when you look at China, its military is not just directed or against India. China has 14 land neighbors and I think 8 maybe maritime neighbors. So, and we have so many fronts, and we have and our strategic focus is the majorly in the east. We have the Taiwan issue, and we have that our major metropolitans are all based in the eastern coastal area. So that's the situation. So when you look at the Chinese, military expenditure, you cannot just think it will all target against India. Yeah, thank you.
I think, Professor Lee, your response is revealing in terms of not just the power asymmetry, but also the perception asymmetry between India and China. And I have a related question on that, which has just come in and Professor Jacob, perhaps you'd like to come in on this. How is India perceiving China's nuclear buildup and its modernization plans, given that India's nuclear arsenal was initially, to deter Chinese aggression? And so how might India's nuclear posture be affected by China's buildup, which is in response to the United States?
So I think fundamentally we have to understand that, for us in India, nuclear weapons are not weapons of war fighting, they are weapons of deterrence. So, you can have all these questions but the point is that, we have a concept called credible minimum deterrence. And, these questions presume that China is willing to take a first strike or even one strike is acceptable. So I don't think that's the way we look at it. So we will certainly develop the sophistication of our delivery systems. Of course, I think that is both the deterrence imperative as well as a sort of a military technology imperative. But we see this as fundamental deterrent, and we think that the Chinese will be deterred by whatever India has, right? So we don't need to go for parity. We are, I think, deterrence is achieved, and I think we are good with it.
Thanks, Jabin. So my question is, and this is just a thought exercise, that on the Indian side, at least in the past 5 years, the narrative has been about the challenges in the India-China relationship. And Jabin, you've talked a lot about the opportunities. I want to flip the question. I want to turn to Professor Lee. And Professor Lee, you've talked a lot about the opportunities in the India-China relationship. And you've spoken a little bit about the challenges, the US factor. But what are really concerns and challenges that you see in the India-China relationship today?
Yeah, as I mentioned, first of all, China think because China have the very complex, neighborhood and many fronts, as I mentioned before. So stable and amicable relations with India is very important. So definitely we expect a friendly India. So if it turns hostile, it's definitely not good. Second, if India lost its strategic autonomy, is also a concern of China. Third, I totally agree with you that it is the perception. As I mentioned, for many years, there's the asymmetric threat perception between China and India. India, actually, have a lot of concerns about China and think China as a major, maybe a rival. But some, at least a perception actually construct your, the other side, their perception about you. When this is according to the constructivism, these perceptions can construct each other. So at the moment, I think it is very important for both sides to read each other correctly. From the Chinese side, I think we cannot expect too high of these bilateral relations, but from the Indian side, we cannot, overread the so-called China threat. Otherwise, this mistrust will always be there, and a lot of potentials between the two countries will not release. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Lee. We still have about 5-10 minutes. So, Jabin, I'll flip the question back. I've said that the strategic community talks a lot about the challenges, and you've talked about some opportunities. But could you expand on that, given the numerous shared challenges that are present today in the international arena, anything from climate change to emerging technology standards, the needs of the global south. How do you see, where do you realistically see sort of India and China coming together to cooperate?
Well, I think, one of the advantages of the 2020 moment, in India-China relations has been, like I said, the sensitization to China within the Indian system. But this is not all negative. It has a lot of advantages. I think a lot more Indians are now studying China, various dimensions of China. We are developing our capacities on China. And this is good because I think the more we learn about the Chinese political system, how the Chinese economy operates, how the Chinese legal system operates, how the Chinese tech environment operates, I think the better we are at coming up with ideas and solutions or frameworks to deal with India-China, to deal with China along these fronts. And these fronts are important. I think, for example, if you noticed when our foreign secretary went to China in January, he not only met the foreign minister and his counterpart, the vice foreign minister, he also met with the head of the international department of the Communist Party of China. And one reason why he met with the international department, remember, this is an Indian government official meeting with an official of the Communist Party, a political party in China. So this means that India has an understanding of the party-state system, number one, but it also means one of the objectives of the international department is to encourage subnational cooperation between India and China, right? So that when Prime Minister Modi first went to China, there was a provincial leaders forum, states and provincial leaders forum. I think this, these non-center centric, to put it if you can, or capital-centric approach to India-China relations is very important because we are two large countries. Not everything happens in Delhi or Beijing. Our economic activity, our dynamism comes from the provinces, from the states, from the localities. And the more India and China can engage at these levels, the greater the possibilities. Of course, we'll also have some problems, but I think those are problems that we should consider as teething problems. Similarly, I think, we, as Chinese language expertise, pay attention to China grows in India. And by the way, this is now no longer limited only to the, the military strategic community or the security community in India. Our traders, our economists, our tech specialists, they're all paying attention to China. How is China doing this? Why is it that India can't do this? And so there is a greater, I think, possibilities of conversation because of these factors. And whatever is happening in the United States or in Europe, if Europe and the United States are turning inwards, then Asia will have only, India and China will only have each other or the rest of the global south to depend on. So, I see these as I see these developments very positively. Hopefully, we'll have more students traveling again across, to India and China. More people. We'll have, one of the possibilities of this latest saw is the revival of direct flights, the return of journalists to each other's countries. Unless we have reportage, Indian reportage on China by Indian reporters and Chinese reportage on India by Chinese reporters, rather than mediated through the West, how are we going to understand each other better? And I think there is a very Indian perspective possible on China. We are two large countries, similar in size, similar in ambitions, similar in administrative scale problems, and so on. So I think there is a way that India understands China that is unique and necessary for the rest of the world to pay attention to. So I see these are the positives, and these are the advantages, I think, that we can build on to improve India-China relations.
Thanks, Jabin. You spoke about more trading connects, more areas where India and China can cooperate. And Professor Lee, I had a question about how China sees the economic opportunity in India, because I can say that there is a genuine debate taking place in government is, the economic engagement with China and defining the contours of that. So there's an argument that there is a massive trade deficit with China, and so if I were to sort of ask you, what is the opportunity that China sees in India in terms of in the economic realm? Is it market access? Is it genuine value addition? And if I could actually be provocative, resilient value chains and supply chains.
Okay, definitely China sees India as a big economic opportunity. It's already happened before, the pandemic. Since I think between 2014 to 2019, you can find the fast increased Chinese investment in India. I believe the Chinese companies made a lot of contributions to the rise of Indian manufacturing of the smartphone. So this is a very good example. However, in the past several years, we can find the Indian side seems not quite welcome this Chinese, investment, and Chinese companies in India met a lot of, difficulties. So I think this kind of not so happy experience have already increased the hesitation of the Chinese companies to invest in India. This is number one. Number two, I think there's still debate inside India whether to reopen or to re-engage with China in the economic front. And the third one, I think, again, it depends on the Indian general ecosystem to the FDI. It's not the difficulties facing the Chinese company, but other international companies. So I think, again, it's still a great potential for the China-India economic cooperation, but still many, obstacles. Yeah.
Thanks, Professor Lee. My final question before I sort of conclude is more forward-looking, and if I could just ask both of you to think about how do you see India-China relations in the next decade, given where we are today, given the changes in the international system, and possibly the changes in the India-China relationship. Where do you see the India-China relationship in the next decade? Jabin, if you'd like to go first.
Okay, so I see a couple of more dust-ups on the LAC. I don't see any resolution of the problem. Even the resolution of the current issue in Eastern Ladakh, let alone the larger boundary dispute. But I do see some progress in resolving some of the problems that Lily just mentioned in terms of the economic engagement. I only hope that the Chinese also see this as progress. I keep coming back to the worldview issue. If China has a particular approach to the world, then we are all in trouble. If zero-sum calculations are what drive economic engagement, political engagement, then and I see this continuing to be a strong trend in the relationship. Any thaws are likely tactical rather than long-term. I think India-China relations will be complicated by extraneous factors, third countries, tensions in the region, tensions in the wider region. But at the same time, I also believe, as I just mentioned, a greater understanding, a greater sense of what the other country is about. I think there will be a greater realization that India and China simply cannot do without each other. No matter the problems in the relationship, they simply cannot do without each other. It doesn't matter the size gap, the differential in power, the differential in the economic side. I mean, the gap between the US and China is also too large. So I think there has to be some way in which India and China will eventually have to find a way to deal with each other. And I don't think, predictions of absolute or across the LAC conflict are warranted. I think India and China have the wisdom to sort of pull back and manage relations as well. Yeah.
Thanks, Jabin. Professor Lee?
Okay. And I think in such a world with so many uncertainties for China and India, I don't think we have better choice. We can only move on. We must well manage and keep the tranquility in the border area. If we can do it in the past, we can do now and in the future. And let's cooperate in other areas, which seems more important for us. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you to both my fellow panelists. Just to sort of offer some concluding reflections, it's very clear that a better understanding is needed between India and China of each other. There are several avenues for cooperation. You can imagine cooperation on the border, more confidence building measures. You can imagine economic engagement. You can imagine people to people engagement and coordination on global challenges. But at the same time, one could argue that each of these facets have been a cause for concern for India in this relationship and a cause of tension. You've had tension at the border, you've had weaponization of economic interdependence. And so there are these sort of hindrances as well. The bottom line being that suspicion still lingers very obviously in this relationship and will continue to. And the exercise that is presently underway of building trust will take a long time to be successful, if it is. There are some positive signals, and I'll just conclude with this: is ever since July last year, when Foreign Minister Jaishankar and China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi met, you had the Chinese actually in their statement talk about finding a new way for big neighbors to live together in harmony. And that's something that I've noticed that even Xi Jinping mentioned his meeting with Prime Minister Narendra Modi in October. And at the same time, India's External Affairs Minister, Dr. Jaishankar, has talked about finding a new equilibrium with China. So to me, it seems that there is this conversation that is underway to find perhaps a new political understanding, a new modus vivendi. We'll see where this conversation goes and where this endeavor goes. But thank you to both my panelists, Professor Lee, Professor Jabin Thomas Jacob, for joining me for this discussion today. And it's been a real pleasure to hear both your views and offer some of my own. Thank you.
Thank you, Saheb. Thank you, Lee.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.